Have you ever stopped and wondered what happens when the person who always had to stay in control suddenly realizes they are not controlling anything anymore? What happens when the one who looked untouchable, calm, proud, and completely unaffected is forced to face a reality they never prepared for? Stay with me, because this changes the way many people understand narcissistic behavior. For a narcissistic person, losing control is not just annoying. It is often deeply disturbing. Control is not simply something they enjoy having. It is something they depend on to feel safe, important, and emotionally steady. In many relationships, they get used to knowing exactly how the other person will react. They expect access. They expect attention. They expect emotional energy, forgiveness, and a door that always stays open. After enough time, this creates a dangerous sense of power. They begin to believe that no matter what happens, the other person will still remain emotionally connected and always within reach. Then one day, that pattern breaks. Someone walks away. Not for a moment, not to make a point. They really leave, and they hold firm boundaries. That is when the old certainty disappears. The narcissistic person can no longer predict what that former partner is feeling, thinking, or doing. They can no longer guide the conversation. They can no longer push buttons and get a reaction. They can no longer shape the story between them. And that loss of influence creates intense inner discomfort, because a major source of their emotional balance may have just been removed. What makes this even harder is that they often see another person's independence as a threat, not as a normal part of life. The moment that former partner becomes emotionally unavailable, starts making choices without them, and no longer asks for approval, the narcissist has to face something they cannot stand. They are no longer the center of that person's emotional world. And that realization can trigger anger, anxiety, frustration, obsessive thinking, and repeated attempts to get back in. What hurts them so much is often not the loss of love itself, but the loss of access, the loss of attention, and the loss of control over emotional outcomes. When that power disappears, it can expose fears and insecurities that were hidden for a very long time under a polished image of superiority. The narcissistic identity often depends heavily on outside validation, because their sense of self is not as solid or as deeply rooted as it may look from the outside. They may appear confident. They may appear certain. They may appear full of self-belief. But in many cases, that image is being held together by the reactions of other people. Praise matters. Admiration matters. Attention matters. Recognition matters. Even emotional reactions, including painful ones, can serve as proof that they are still important, powerful, desirable, or above others. Instead of creating steady self-worth from within, they often rely on people around them to confirm it again and again. This reaches into almost every area of life. In relationships, they may need constant reassurance, emotional investment, and signs that they still matter. In social situations, they may become deeply focused on status, image, success, appearance, or the impression they leave behind. Even small criticism can feel huge because it threatens the image they work so hard to defend. Positive attention strengthens that image. Rejection, indifference, or loss of admiration shakes it. So when the person who once gave them validation steps away, the narcissist is not just losing a partner. They may also be losing a source of psychological fuel. Suddenly, the compliments are gone. The emotional reactions are gone. The attention is gone. The easy access is gone. This can create insecurity, restlessness, frustration, and sometimes obsession. They may search for fresh validation. They may try to recover old sources. They may become consumed with proving their value. And this is the deeper issue. It is not just about wanting attention. It is about needing outside approval to hold together a fragile sense of identity, importance, and emotional balance. No contact creates a very specific kind of psychological pressure because it cuts off the channels a narcissistic person often uses to maintain influence, gather information, and feel emotionally powerful. In many relationships, they become used to access. They know what the other person is thinking, how they are feeling, what they are doing, and how available they still are. That access may come through direct messages, social media, shared friends, repeated conflict, or constant checking in. Even negative interactions can still serve a purpose because they prove that the emotional connection is alive. But when no contact begins and is kept strong, the whole system changes. The narcissist no longer knows what that person is doing. They do not know who they are with. They do not know whether they are sad, angry, relieved, or already moving on. And that uncertainty can become painfully hard to tolerate because predictability is gone. The person who once felt completely reachable is now psychologically out of reach. That creates curiosity, then frustration, then pressure. Silence is powerful because it leaves space for unanswered questions. Without communication, the narcissist cannot test whether their influence still works. They cannot pull for reassurance. They cannot defend their image directly. They cannot easily rewrite the narrative in real time. And so they may begin asking themselves things they do not want to ask. Have I been forgotten? Have I been replaced? Am I completely out of that person's life now? This is why silence can feel even more threatening than open rejection. With rejection, there is something to argue with, something to fight, something to challenge. With silence, there is only uncertainty. And uncertainty can become unbearable to someone who depends on control. This is why no contact can trigger anxiety, anger, fixation, and repeated attempts to break back in. The pressure comes from losing information and influence at the exact same time. And if you have lived through this, keep listening, because the next part explains why their behavior can become so confusing. The ego starts to crack when the image a narcissistic person built so carefully can no longer be supported by real life. Much of their stability depends on believing they are special, unforgettable, powerful, desired, or fully in charge. That self-image often acts like a shield. It protects them from deeper feelings they do not want to face, feelings like shame, inadequacy, insecurity, rejection, or vulnerability. As long as they keep receiving admiration, attention, validation, or compliance, that shield stays in place. The doubts remain hidden. But once a major source of that support disappears, especially when someone walks away and refuses to return, cracks begin to show. Suddenly, the narcissist is seeing evidence that does not match the story they tell themselves. The person they expected to come back stays gone. The person they believed needed them continues moving forward without them. The influence they once trusted stops working or disappears altogether. This creates a painful conflict between the image they hold inside and the reality happening outside. That conflict can be deeply unsettling. It forces them to face questions they usually avoid. If I am really that powerful, why can't I control this anymore? If I am really that unforgettable, why is someone living well without me? If I mattered so much, why is the story continuing without my involvement? These are not small questions for a person whose identity leans on grand self-belief. They strike at the center of the protective image, and as that pressure grows, stronger emotional reactions often begin to rise. Mood changes may become sharper. Defensiveness may become stronger. Irritability may rise. Obsessive thoughts may become more frequent. Sensitivity to criticism may get worse. The person may try harder to gather attention, twist the story, blame other people, or recover control. But beneath all of that, something more fragile is happening. They are struggling to keep an idealized self-image alive while reality keeps pushing against it. And when that happens, the hidden vulnerability they spent years covering up begins to show through the cracks. When certainty disappears, obsession often takes its place. During the relationship, the narcissistic person may have felt safe in the belief that they understood the other person's emotions, reactions, and future choices. They may have believed that no matter how much distance appeared on the surface, they would still remain in that person's mind, still important, still emotionally central, still impossible to fully escape. That belief gave them control. It gave them predictability. It helped support the image they carried of themselves. But once that certainty is gone, a strange psychological emptiness can open up. The former partner is no longer explaining, defending, reacting, or giving emotional feedback. And instead of receiving proof that they still matter, the narcissist is left with silence and unanswered questions. That is where fixation can grow. They may begin wondering what that person is thinking. They may wonder whether they have moved on, whether someone else is there now, whether they are being remembered at all. And for someone who depends on access and emotional control, not knowing can feel unbearable. So the thoughts become more frequent, more intrusive. They may replay old conversations, revisit memories, reanalyze moments, search for clues that explain what happened. They may check social media, ask mutual friends for information, build stories in their own mind to fill the silence. What used to feel like confidence slowly turns into preoccupation. And this part is important, so don't miss it. The obsession is not always coming from love, tenderness, or real emotional closeness. Very often, it is being driven by discomfort, by not knowing, by the loss of control over someone else's inner world. Human beings naturally want closure, but for someone who relies on influence to feel steady, uncertainty can hit much harder. The inability to predict, reach, or shape the other person's emotional reality can turn confidence into rumination, and rumination into a cycle that gets harder to escape the longer the silence continues. A new relationship often does not fix the deeper problem, even when it looks that way from the outside. Many people think that when a narcissistic person quickly moves on, it means they have fully recovered, forgotten the past, or found something better. But what often happens is more temporary than it seems. The new relationship may act as a fresh source of validation, not as a true healing of inner wounds. At the beginning, the new person may offer admiration, excitement, emotional investment, attention, and novelty. For the narcissist, this can feel like relief. It brings back what felt lost. The attention tells them they are still desirable. The admiration supports their image. The new energy distracts them from feelings of rejection, insecurity, or uncertainty. For a while, everything may look stable again, but the deeper emotional needs that existed before usually remain exactly where they were. The need for constant validation does not disappear. The fear of losing control does not disappear. Sensitivity to criticism does not disappear. Dependence on outside approval does not disappear just because a new person enters the picture. And over time, the new relationship changes, just like all relationships do. The early glow fades. The new partner becomes a real human being instead of an ideal mirror. Differences appear, expectations grow, imperfections become visible. When that happens, the same insecurities that shaped earlier relationships can rise again. The narcissist may begin wanting more attention. They may become disappointed. They may feel threatened when the new person no longer gives endless admiration. What they hoped would erase discomfort often only covers it for a short time. The new supply treats the symptom, not the cause, so the relief rarely lasts. Beneath the surface, the same unresolved emotional pain remains in place, waiting for the moment when the new source of validation no longer feels powerful enough. And when that moment comes, the old cycle can return with surprising force. Anger and desperation often rise together because they grow from the same wound: the loss of control, the loss of validation, and the loss of certainty. When a narcissistic person realizes that someone they once influenced is no longer responding in expected ways, frustration can hit hard. The anger comes from one simple fact: reality is no longer following their script. The desperation comes from another fact: their usual methods of regaining influence may not be working anymore. Those two emotional states can exist at the same time, and together they can create behavior that feels confusing, intense, and unpredictable. The anger usually moves outward first. They may blame the former partner, criticize them, spread a negative story, present themselves as the victim. This helps protect their image because it moves responsibility away from them and places it on someone else. Accepting that another person has moved forward on their own can be deeply threatening because it challenges their belief in their own importance. But under that anger, desperation may already be building. They may become more focused on regaining access. They may reach out unexpectedly. They may use mutual contacts. They may monitor online activity. They may search for openings that let them step back into the other person's life. These actions are often driven by the need to restore certainty and reduce the inner discomfort created by distance. And because anger and desperation feed each other, the cycle can become stronger over time. The more their attempts fail, the more frustrated they may feel. The more frustrated they feel, the stronger the urge becomes to recover control. This can lead to sharp shifts in behavior. One moment there is hostility, then nostalgia, then blame, then charm, then self-pity, then sudden attempts to reconnect. It can look chaotic from the outside, but underneath it all is one central struggle. They are trying to cope with a reality they do not want to accept. And if that sounds familiar, then you already know why staying firm matters more than explaining yourself one more time. The real crisis is often happening inside, not outside. That is one of the most important things to understand. The deepest challenge for a narcissistic person is usually not just losing one relationship. It is being pushed closer to parts of themselves they have spent years trying to avoid. Many narcissistic behaviors are built to protect a fragile sense of self from feelings of shame, inadequacy, rejection, loneliness, fear, or emotional vulnerability. By focusing on achievement, status, admiration, control, appearance, or influence, they can keep those painful feelings pushed far into the background. As long as that system works, they may not have to look inward very much at all. But when a major source of validation disappears, especially after someone leaves and refuses to come back, that protective system can start to weaken. The attention that once helped them feel stable is gone. The emotional investment they once depended on is gone. The sense of control that once kept deeper feelings buried is gone. And without those supports, uncomfortable emotions can start rising toward the surface. Insecurity may become harder to ignore. Self-doubt may become louder. Loneliness may become more obvious. Feelings of inadequacy or fear may start showing through. What makes this inner crisis so difficult is that it cannot be solved fully by outside solutions. A new partner may help for a while. More praise may help for a while. More success may help for a while. More attention may help for a while. But none of those things touches the deeper emotional wound. So the person may keep searching outside for a fix, while the real pain remains inside, unexamined and unresolved. This creates growing tension. On one side, there is the need to keep looking strong, superior, and fully in control. On the other side, there is the reality of hidden emotional pain that is asking to be faced. The more they avoid self-examination, the more energy it takes to protect the image, and over time, that inner strain can become harder and harder to hide. What often looks dramatic on the surface is only the outer expression of a much deeper battle. The panic is not always about missing a person in a loving way. The obsession is not always about connection. The sudden new relationship is not always proof of healing. The blame is not always truth. The angry messages, the monitoring, the charm, the self-pity, the attempts to come back, all of it may be part of one larger effort to repair a damaged sense of control. And that is why it is so important not to romanticize the collapse. Stay with me here, because this part matters. When a narcissist appears to be spiraling, the deeper battle is rarely only about the relationship itself. It is about losing the strategies that once protected their self-image. It is about losing certainty, losing access, losing validation, losing the power to shape another person's emotional reality. That is why what looks like confidence can suddenly become fixation. What looked like indifference can become rage. What looked like moving on can turn into monitoring and desperate attempts to return. The breaking point does not truly begin the day someone walks away. It begins when the old methods stop working. It begins when the tools they relied on to feel important, stable, and powerful no longer protect them from reality. And reality can be brutal when it finally gets through. It says the other person may not come back. It says control is not guaranteed. It says admiration can disappear. It says silence can close a door that manipulation once kept open. For the person who left, this is the reminder you need to hold close. Their reaction is not proof that you made the wrong choice. It is not proof that you owe them access. It is not proof that you must step back in and explain yourself again. Sometimes your silence is simply exposing what their old system can no longer hide. If you have gone through this yourself, then you know the most difficult part of healing is often resisting the urge to make sense of every reaction they have. You may look at their anger and think it means they care deeply. You may look at their obsession and think it means you still matter in a special way. You may look at their new relationship and think you were erased. But very often, these behaviors are not clear signs of healthy emotional depth. They are signs of disturbance inside a system that depended on control, access, and outside validation to stay intact. And that understanding can free you. Because healing is not about proving your worth to the person who hurt you. It is not about winning. It is not about revenge. It is not about waiting for them to admit the damage they caused. It is not even about watching them finally understand what they lost. Healing is about stepping out of the emotional theater altogether. It is about choosing peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, boundaries over old patterns. It is about accepting that some people do not break because they lost love. They break because the system they use to avoid themselves stops working. And when that happens, they may search harder, react louder, and reach more desperately, not because they have become more emotionally honest, but because they are being cornered by realities they never wanted to face. So if you walked away and kept walking, do not underestimate the power of that choice. You did more than leave a relationship. You stepped out of a cycle that may have been feeding someone else's unstable sense of self. You stopped participating in a pattern that kept giving them emotional certainty at your expense. And once that pattern ends, the discomfort they feel can be intense. But that discomfort belongs to them. Your job is not to carry it. Your job is to protect your peace, trust your boundaries, and keep moving toward a life that no longer revolves around someone else's need for control. And in the end, that may be the clearest truth of all. What appears to be a breakdown is often the moment when illusion meets reality. The image of being untouchable starts to crack. The fantasy of permanent access starts to fail. The belief that someone will always be emotionally available begins to collapse. And under all of that is a person struggling with a self they have spent years trying not to face. That does not excuse the harm they caused. It does not erase the pain, confusion, or emotional damage left behind. But it does explain why the reaction can become so intense when you finally pull your energy back and stop playing the role they counted on. Once the old responses disappear, once the reassurance stops, once the emotional access is cut off, they may be left standing in front of a silence they cannot control. And for someone who built stability around power over others, that silence can feel like a mirror they never wanted to look into. So if you needed a sign to stop doubting your decision, let this be it. Their crisis is not your assignment. Their obsession is not your responsibility. Their anger is not your truth. Their attempts to return are not always about love. Often they are about restoring a system that centered them and drained you. And the moment you understand that deeply, something shifts. You stop seeing their reaction as a mystery you have to solve. You stop waiting for justice to come through their self-awareness. You stop measuring your healing by what they do next. And that is where real freedom starts. Quietly, firmly, without performance, without revenge, without needing to be seen. Just one boundary at a time, one day at a time, one clear step after another. And if this opened your eyes, hold on to that clarity. Because the person who keeps walking, who stays grounded, who does not return to chaos just because chaos calls louder, is often the one who finally breaks the cycle for good.